Okay, so welcome everyone to the Profitable Regeneration webinar series here with Jim Gerrish. And this is also part of the Profitable Steward Podcast. We're honored to have Jim here with us. As we get started, I've asked James Stewart if he would unmute. He's going to offer us a prayer here to kick this off.
Our Heavenly Father, we're grateful for this day and the many blessings that we enjoy. We're grateful for the moisture that a lot of our country has received and for the grass that will grow because of it. We're grateful for stewardship that has given us for work in agriculture, to feed the nation and to grow and progress our abilities. We're grateful for Jim and his dedication and lifelong quest to grow and learn. We ask we can learn from him this day. We love thee. We're grateful for our Savior. And this we say in his name, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much, Jim. I appreciate you doing that on a short notice. So I met Jim Gerrish. It's been nearly 20 years ago, I think, after attending the Ranching for Profit school. And we fumbled around with grazing, and I realized there was a lot that I didn't know. And when the pain is great enough, we'll seek out somebody who has tools, expertise that we lack. When I met Jim, I don't know if Jim remembers this or not, but we thought we were being frugal and low tech, and I was winding up my polywire on a stick. My first reel came from Jim Gerrish, and I thought, man, why didn't I do this a long time ago? This saves me so much time and frustration. But I didn't know. I didn't know that there were tools available, or I didn't see the value in it until somebody showed me. Like, okay, here's a simple tool that'll save you time. And the thing of it is, if we don't have a level of efficiency in the work that we do, we're just going to get frustrated and we're going to give up on it. And that's about where I was. Jim is not only a great consultant, he does what he preaches. He's also a really great coach. And I'll tell just a quick story to illustrate that. When we were bouncing around in the pickup, I made the comment, we were just looking at different parts of the ranch we operate. So a little context for who I am, for those of you that are new. I'm a third generation rancher on our family's ranch in northeastern Nevada. My wife and I are blessed to be able to work the ranch. My grandfather started, my mother continued to build, and my grandmother was a big part of that as well. So grandparents, parents, and now my wife and I, and we're raising our 9 kids here on that same ranch in Nevada. It's changed and it's evolved. We went from a year-round cow-calf operation to now we're just seasonal, and we run custom grazing cattle primarily through the summer and destock in the winter. So when I met Jim, we were trying to implement grazing, and I remember making the comment, I haven't been real religious about grazing management. And Jim just sat there for a minute on the other passenger side of the pickup, and he asked a question. He said, when do you think you'll get religious about it, Jared? And I thought, he didn't tell me what to do. He didn't try to expound on the benefits of grazing and how much more money I could make and the increased stock days. He came back with a powerful question using my own word, religious, meaning that I wasn't committed to it. And it made me think. And I think that has to have been at least 18 years ago, Jim. And I remember the place that we were out on the ranch. I remember the pickup that we were driving. And I remember probably word for word that question, because it made me think. And really, that's all the reason at Ag Steward. We're helping you to think. Like Jim had the answers, but he had to help me to want the answer and to ask the right question so that I would be open to receiving it from him. That's when you know you're working with a good coach and somebody who has expertise. He's got a ton of knowledge and wisdom, and I'm honored to have him here with us today. I think it is very timely. Here in the West, we're just coming out of dormancy, and we've had a very tough winter. We're looking forward to a great grazing season. But in order to do that, we need to have a plan. And that plan needs to be based on principles. And that's what we're here to learn. And no high expectations, Jim. I just told him at the beginning, we're dealing with record high input costs, and he's just got to help us make it profitable. So with that, let's introduce Jim Gerrish. Jim is, sometimes I ask just random questions. So to start it off, is there anything about you that maybe isn't in your bio that's just an interesting tidbit, like maybe you won the kissing contest in high school or something that we don't know about you?
I don't know. There's a lot that's not in my bio, and some of it's just as well that you don't know a thing about on me. But I remember that pickup at that ride and you asking that question.
Do you?
I do. And me turning the answer back into a question to you about, because I know you're religious in a lot of other aspects of your life. And it was an interesting choice of words that you made to say you weren't religious about your grazing. And I really believe that if we are setting out not only to save ourselves, but to save our ranches, to save our land, to save our communities, we've absolutely got to be religious about it, because that is what drives people to make a difference. And we sure need to be making a difference in our communities.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's that level of commitment, I think, is really what it takes, because at that time I had a young man that worked for us. I don't know if you remember Lance, but he was religious about it. And he figured it out, and he in a matter of a few months he exceeded my expertise because he practiced. And then once we saw that it could be done, it's okay, this can be done. And sometimes seeing is believing, but sometimes you don't see it until you believe it. And I don't know which comes first, but regardless, Jim, we'll just let you jump right in and explain some of the key principles of grazing. You're welcome to share slides if you'd like to. For those that are on the webinar, we can talk through them. For those that are listening to the podcast, we have to keep it more of a dialogue.
It was suggested to me that I not show slides and that it be more of a conversation. Yeah, I could whip out any number of slides and examples, pictures and tables and figures, but I'm perfectly comfortable just talking with my hands about stuff too. Principles, as you said, a lot of us are either just coming out of winter or aren't quite out of it yet. And a lot of us also have behind us a year or two or three of not very good seasons, a lot of drought through the western half of the country where most of our participants are from. And it's very tempting when you see green grass in the spring after 5 months of snow cover and feeding 3 tons of hay per cow when you're used to feeding a half a ton or something. It is very tempting to go out there after that first green grass. And whether or not you can do that really depends on what it is that you're going to do tomorrow on that piece of ground. And I often refer to a study that was done by ARS here in Idaho. And for those of you, ARS is USDA Agricultural Research Service. So in this particular study, they had looked at when grass is in its transition from phase 1 to phase 2. That is basically if a grass tiller has only 2 leaves on it, it's in phase 1, which means it's drawing more energy from stored carbohydrates than it's getting from photosynthesis. And once we have 3 full leaves out there, then we've moved into phase 2, and there's net energy gain taking place in the plant. But it's real tempting to go out on that early transitional grass. And when I say transitional, I mean moving from 2 leaves to 3 leaves. So it's moving from phase 1 into phase 2. And in this study, they looked at what happens if you put cattle out there for a day, I think for a week. They may have done a day, 3 days a week, and then 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, where they just put them on the pasture and left them there. And what they found is with the being out there for 1 day to a week, but then if you moved it off and let the grass recover, you actually ended up with the same total production for the year as if you had delayed until it was fully into phase 2 before you went out. And then if you went out there for 2 weeks before you moved them off of it, you'd give up like 10 to 15% of the yield potential of the year. And at 4 weeks, it was 20 to 30% yield reduction. And if you just went out and parked for the first 6 weeks of the season, you basically reduce the production potential of that year until, or excuse me, to less than 50%. So that's why I say all the time, and everybody knows they make jokes about me saying it depends way too much, but it really does depend. So starting on that first green grass that you see, it depends on what you're going to be able to do tomorrow, and then let it go to full recovery. So that's the first thing you have to be thinking about at this time of the year. And as you said, Jared, you got to have a plan. So what is your plan? Are you just going to throw them out on that early green grass and then leave them there for weeks or months? And if you do that, you are really setting the pasture back and hurting yourself. If you have a plan to where you can go out to a fenced area, be there for a day to a week, and then to the next fenced area and the next, to where we're doing time-controlled grazing across it. And as soon as we move off that first piece, it's moving back into the recovery phase. And yeah, you can get off of feed early if you have a plan to just take a bite off of your grass and then move away from it. So I think that's the first thing. Then, depending on what type of environment we're in, whether it's a dry land, semi-arid, or in the humid east or under irrigation, we all have to be doing a different planning. On our rangeland, where our average annual precip is just 7 to 8 inches, probably pretty close to what Clover Valley is. I don't remember what yours was there. May have been a little higher than that, but not a lot.
Pretty close.
Yeah, that's a once a year grazing deal. There's not going to be enough recovery to come back to it the second time. So basically, if you're in the semi-arid rangeland region, that's where your mindset has to be, is have enough either subdivisions of pasture or the ability to subdivide your pastures that you can get that early bite off of something and not be relying on coming back to it again. In our irrigated situation here, we've got desert rangeland and we have center pivots. And with the center pivots, we expect to graze them 3 or 4 times through the course of the season. And so if that is, what the protocol is, after you do your first grazing, you're thinking in terms of not that I'm done with this for the season, but how much recovery do I need to allow before I come back to it for the second grazing, and then subsequently the third. From a standpoint of plant physiology and looking at what the plants are doing and how they're recovering, the only difference between the desert rangeland and the center pivot is it happens only once growing cycle in the desert, then it's happening 3 or 4 times in the irrigated land. But the same cues that we're looking for on whether grass is recovered or not, no, it's the same in both of those situations. I always say when you have water, things happen really fast. When you don't have water, things happen very slowly, but it is the same things that are happening that we have to understand the plant response and how we manage the time of balancing the time of use and the time for recovery. You want to jump in with the next key question for?
Yeah, that's good. I remember you writing an article in the Grass Farmer when you had the pivot that was not supplying water adequately, and you realized there was a decrease in production. And so as regenerative farmers and ranchers, like one of our main goals needs to be building soil organic matter, right? So that we're building that resilience into our plan. So I guess, could you speak to that since we're on that subject of irrigation? And I don't know how many other people on here graze irrigated fields, but it makes up only 10% geographically of our ranch, but it produces over 50% of the feed.
Yeah.
So obviously what we do, we're going to have a lot greater marginal reaction on our irrigated fields than we are on our
Right.
rangeland. Not that we disregard our rangeland, but if we focus our fertility, which we have been doing ourselves, compost teas and things on the irrigated, we're going to get a bigger response as far as total pounds of production or stock days, however you measure that. I guess to maybe just speak on that a little bit more. I don't know that it's
Okay.
a question.
Yeah, I know where I need to go now. We talk a lot about post-grazing residual. Residual is the green living material that's left behind after grazing. There's also the term residue, but more often we talk about litter. Residue, litter, duff, those are basically the same things. That's dead plant material that's, again, left behind after grazing or left behind after weathering. And they're both key parts of building soil health. I'll talk first about post-grazing residual. The first thing that we as ranchers need to understand is that we are really in the land management business. I think the main reason so many ranches are unprofitable is because they only think they're in the livestock business, and they have a great deal of focus and they put a lot of management into their livestock and not nearly enough into the land. When you think about a ranch, most of our costs are really land-based costs. They're not individual animal costs other than the purchase price of the animals themselves. The salt and mineral, the vet, the trucking, those are minor costs compared to our investment in land, in fence, in seed. Not everybody does seed and fertilizer, but some producers do spend a lot on those inputs, but almost all of us have a lot invested in the land itself, whether that's in ownership or because we're leasing it. And so to me, our first focus is increasing the productivity of the land. And to increase the productivity of the land, our focus in a high rainfall environment or irrigated environment, it is absolutely capturing as much solar energy on every acre as we can, because photosynthesis is capturing carbon from the atmosphere, cycling it through our plants, running it to the soil. And that's how we build healthy, productive soils. In a rangeland or desert environment, our first focus actually needs to be capturing every drop of water. There's going to be abundant sunlight on our rangelands. It is water that is always the limitation to our productivity. So in irrigation and productive environments, our first objective is that maximization of photosynthesis. In the semi-arid environment, it's maximizing the efficiency of our water cycle or optimizing the efficiency of our water cycle. And that is how we will get the highest level of photosynthesis, is if we're capturing every drop of water, holding it on our landscape, storing it in the soil for future use. So we do have those slightly different objectives, whether we're talking about productive land or rangeland. But in either of those cases, the post-grazing residual is what determines what the recovery rate of our plants are going to be. And to me, one of the mantras of grazing is, I will have no fear of wasting grass. Because if you let your livestock waste grass, that's great, that's cool, because that's how you build soil and a more diverse and stronger plant community. Another one of the mantras is, grass feeds the soil, then grass can feed the livestock. Again, too many of your neighbors are focused on just this idea of, like, got to feed the cows, got to feed the cows, got to feed the cows. And they ignore the fact that first they have to take care of the grass feeding the grass and building their soil. And if your focus is on managing the grass to build soil, the livestock almost just come along for the ride. Post-grazing residual is a key point of grazing management. And I'm very often asked, how tall should I leave that? And it's not really how tall you should leave it. What I try to teach people to do and encourage people to do is visualize the amount of solar energy capture that will take place when you take the livestock off of that pasture. We want to leave intact green leaf out there, because when you have intact green leaf, photosynthesis will continue, and the recovery rate if we had two pastures, one that was left with ample leaf cover, one with minimal leaf cover, the recovery rate is always going to be faster on the one that has ample leaf cover left behind compared to the one that has minimal leaf cover and is trying to is trying to draw from stored carbohydrates. Don't necessarily think about how tall the residual should be. Just look at it and think in terms of how much solar energy am I capturing when the animals leave? And if the answer is 0, that was a mistake. And you don't want to make that mistake repeatedly, because that is what destroys the land. What is a reasonable target? In productive environments, I'd like to think that I'm still capturing 40% of the incoming solar energy with what I am leaving behind the cows. In a rangeland environment, that's more likely only going to be 10 to 15%, because remember, we're probably starting from only about a 40 to a maximum of 50% potential energy capture. It takes really healthy, diverse, and productive rangeland to be able to capture more than about 45-50% of incoming solar radiation. That's why I say that it is not the amount of sunlight we're capturing that's the limitation to productivity. It's how much water we're capturing that's the limitation to productivity. All right, so that's the residual story. Now I want to talk about plant litter, or the residue that we leave behind. The residue or litter is what is plant material that we leave, hopefully, at the soil surface. And that is the Soil Health Academy guys, Ray Archuleta, Gabe Brown, they'll refer to that as armoring the soil. That's the armor we put on the soil to break the impact of raindrops or our sprinkler water, or worse yet, a traveling gun irrigation system. Tremendous impact that puts on the ground. It's breaking the impact of raindrops falling. It's creating a sponging effect at the soil surface so that water can be retained there rather than running off and then be infiltrated into the soil profile, the water. The litter also serves to keep the soil temperature lower so that we minimize the amount of evaporative water loss. Because remember, evaporation does not create cow feed. In that evapotranspiration term we use for the total use of water from a plant community, it is the transpiration part of it that creates new cow feed. And so we want to always be trying to minimize the water loss from evaporation so that we have more water left for transpiration to support growth. And if you graze too severely, you don't have post-grazing residual left out there, how are you possibly going to create litter? Litter is wasted grass. That's why I say there's no such thing as wasting grass. We've got to be willing to give the earth back its share of that production. And you hear some of the grazers and grazing gurus talk about trampling, managing high stock density, and deliberately making long, narrow pastures so the cattle do a lot of trampling rather than just grazing. That's all for the objective of putting more litter on the soil surface to accomplish that protection of the soil. Now, you'll hear some people say you build organic matter by trampling a lot of material down. That's not really true. You build organic matter by having deeper and vigorous rooting systems, and that is driven by what your productivity, the amount of photosynthesis above ground. So the trampling of vegetative material at the surface is for litter development and armoring, protecting the water cycle, keeping the soil cooler. But to actually build greater level of organic matter, sequester carbon, so to speak, at deeper levels in the profile, we have to support that by having a lot of photosynthesis on the top of the plant that's pumping carbon deeper and deeper into the soil.
That's great. That is perfect. So pumping carbon into the soil, and the only time that is happening is when the plant is in its vegetative state. Is that right?
No, that's not exactly right. I won't say that the only time it's happening is in its vegetative state. You do have to have green leaf photosynthesis taking place. So when we're in that phase one part of the growth curve, we're not putting a lot of carbon into the soil simply because we don't have much leaf area to do it. In the phase two rapid growth, that's where we're pumping the most carbon to the soil. Now, when we get into phase three, there still will be some carbon flow to the soil, to the microbes. And I've just been saying to the soil, make sure everybody understands that what we're talking about is the direct feeding of the biology in the soil from the living plant. 50 years ago, and I'm afraid to say it is almost 50 years ago that I was in college, we were largely taught that plants died and then microbes decomposed them and released minerals. The new science of the 21st century is this direct commercial interchange between the higher plants, living plants, and living biology of the photosynthesizing plants, transferring energy deliberately to microbes in exchange for mineral collection, checks and balances against pathogenic organisms, both bacterial diseases, fungal diseases, but also nematodes and insects. That's the direct commerce that's taking place on a daily basis. So that energy flow from the plants feeding the microbes, we want to keep that working for us as many days of the year as possible. That feeding rate slows down when we get to phase three. And we almost always only talk about phase 1, 2, and 3 of grass growth. There's really phase 4 and phase 5 also. Phase 5 is when we have mature seed forming on the plants. Phase 4 is from seed head, full seed head emergence to pollination, through pollination. Basically, in conversation, we just lump those all and call it phase 3. But when you get out to phase 5, mature seed forming, that's when there's no longer any net carbon transfer to the soil microbes. As we're into boot stage, early heading, pre-pollination, there's still a decent amount of energy flow to the microbes, but it is much less than in phase 2. In an irrigated environment or in the high rainfall east, it is our objective to try to keep as many acres in phase 2 as many days of the year as possible. Now, in a rangeland environment, because our growing season might only be 40, 45, 60 days, but our grazing season for some outfits is 12 months. You're going to graze almost all of that forage in phase 3. And through a big part of that time, no, there is almost no net energy transfer to the soil because the plants have stopped photosynthesizing. That's just the nature of rangeland grazing is most of it's going to be in phase 3, 4, or 5, not in phase 2. We just have a very small window, a few pastures that we're going to be able to hit in spring and early summer that on rangeland that we're actually going to be grazing rangeland in phase 2. And there we try to avoid grazing the same pasture in phase 2 in successive years. That's why we always want to change our seasonality of grazing. It isn't that we need a 12-month recovery period. We need a 13 to 17, 18-month recovery period so that we're grazing each range unit at a different time of year in successive years.
That's perfect. I think, one of the reasons that I invited you on is one of our clients operates largely on rangeland. But regardless, I guess maybe back up just a little bit, or not necessarily back up, but let's talk about what are from your standpoint, key steps, key principles to a successful grazing system. So I know timing is one of them, stock density, but kind of you can just lay that foundation for somebody who is just barely getting started that applied to either irrigated or.
Okay. Yeah. Something that it took me a number of years to unlearn, because again, when I was in school, we were basically taught everything was set stocking theory, that you have a space, you put certain number of animals out there based on your estimated carrying capacity, and you leave them there. Now, the guidance actually said you leave them there until they graze to an appropriate post-grazing residual, and then they're removed. Now, pretty much all of your neighbors forgot that last line, and it by default became you leave them out there until it's all gone. And again, when I was in school, in no class that I took, in no textbook that we used was stock density ever mentioned. The whole aspect of time being an important component of grazing management was completely ignored. And so what I've learned over my career is that the management of time is more critical to successful grazing management, to successful ranch regeneration, to building healthy soils. The management of time is far more important than simply the management of space. And I'll break this into the notion of a grazing cycle. So each grazing cycle consists of a grazing period. That's when the plants are actually being assaulted by the grazing animal. And then we have a recovery period. In rangeland grazing, very often our grazing cycle is the entire season, and we have one grazing event and then a recovery period. Now, unfortunately, again, for a lot of your neighbors, that grazing event is 6 months long or something. And there is, for recovery to occur, it has to happen in the actual in the actual growing season. You can't graze all summer and then rest it all winter and think you've accomplished something. You haven't. If you look at the grazing period, mostly negative things are happening to the plant and soil. The animals are biting off leaves, so photosynthesis is being reduced. If we reduce photosynthesis on the top of the plant, that's less energy flow to the root system. It has to contract, and it reduces or almost completely stops the direct transfer of energy from the plant to the microbes. And then we also, the only time that you're going to get soil compaction happening in a pasture is when animals are actually on that piece of pasture. So mostly negative things happen during the grazing period. If we then think about the recovery period, mostly positive things happening. Leaves start growing again, the root system expands, we're feeding the microbes. That root expansion, feeding the microbes, breaks up soil compaction. And so during the recovery period, it's mostly positive things happening. And to me, that is the simplest explanation of why we want shorter grazing periods and extend recovery periods, because we want to minimize the number of days in the growing season that negative things are happening in the pasture. That's why we make short grazing periods, longer recovery periods. And that is the key to successful grazing management. It's almost entirely time-based. Once you can move your mind away from spatial management of just this size pasture will carry this number of animals for this many days. Once you move past that and start focusing on effective time management, that's how we radically increase the grazing, the carrying capacity of a pasture, is when we change from spatial management to time-based management.
Perfect. How important on a rangeland situation specifically is stock density from an overall management standpoint? I think that's one of the things that we struggle with, because here in our carrying capacity here in the desert regions is so low on a per cow per acre basis, and access to water and those things. And is it still as critical, or can you speak to that, I guess, specifically from a range land perspective?
Okay, first thing, I do not believe that there is a magical level of stock density that must be achieved to make progress in soil regeneration, land development, making everything healthier. And the reason there's not a magical stock density is because there's 4 factors that determine what the appropriate stock density is for a particular situation. On the top of this equation, we have available forage and the target temporal utilization rate. So how much grass is out there and how much of it are you willing to use today? And so that ties us right back to appropriate post-grazing residual building litter. And then the bottom of the equation is, what does each animal need to eat and how many days does this piece of ground need to feed them for? So those are the factors that determine the appropriate stock density for this plant community. Now, obviously, if you're in a rangeland setting and your total availability of forage is 600 pounds, and you determine the appropriate utilization rate is only 25% of that, because before I moved west, I thought take half, leave half was a good guideline for everything. And what I've learned is it is not. We need to have at least 1 ton, 2,000 pounds of dry matter production before I'm interested in utilizing 50% of it. At 600 pounds, we're only going to be shooting for taking off 20 to 25%. And that doesn't support a very high stock density, does it? It's about 6 head. It's about 6 head to the acre. And the only way that you're going to run like a 200,000 pound stock density on rangeland is if you are doing herding and you're basically just continuously moving them along one mouthful at a time. So I don't think stock density per se is the question on rangeland. It is time of exposure. And again, when I first moved west, because people said it was fine, I thought 3 or 4 weeks was a reasonable length of time to be on a range unit. And then that dropped down to 2 weeks and then 10 days. And I'm at the point now where if you can pull it off and figure out how to do it, yeah, move them every day. But certainly you should be no longer than 5 to 7 days on a particular piece of rangeland. And part of that has to do with maintaining healthy rumen function, managing the protein energy balance of the rumen. That's part of that short period. But it is also when that plant is bitten, if there are stored carbohydrates available, the plant will try to draw on those. And we might not see the visible growth taking place, but that energy is being drawn to the growing part of the plant, and it is susceptible to being removed. So we've been 19 years now in Idaho. And yeah, my having actually come out here, lived here, worked in this environment, and yes, my main focus is the pivots here, but we have our foothills rangeland. We have our desert rangeland that goes with this unit. And I've learned a few things about grazing the desert also. And when I have done daily moves on our desert rangeland, it gives me a whole lot more animal unit days per acre. And in the following year, I've got a better plant response out there. So
Alejandro Carrillo is a great example of that and what he's been
Yep.
able to do in the Chihuahuan desert, where you think, how can you, there's no feed at all to begin with. But so that's that's great. One question. Sorry, this kind of bouncing around here a little bit, Jim, but one question. So when you on irrigated fields, again, we flood irrigate, and I think maybe some of the other people do here, but it tends to, I know, create an anaerobic condition during that flooding, try to dry it out and firm it up before we expose it to cattle. What is the effect of overwatering on grass production, specifically from the root standpoint?
Okay. Yeah, roots need oxygen. And if you have, and I, on the upper end of our flood ground, I have this situation, and the way I've tried to deal with it is shortening up the length of the physical length, the distance of the sets, because what I've seen on the upper end of that, where we have to run water for a more extended time period just so we could get the lower end of the set properly watered, our desirable plants are largely absent. We have a lot more the slender rush, other wetland plants there. If we are able to grow grass, it's probably going to be Garrison, and the palatability of that declines much faster than the western wheat, the orchard grass, the brome that we have further down the set. So overwatering and staying too long in that anaerobic state definitely changes your plant community to what I would consider a less desirable, from a foraging standpoint, to a less desirable plant community.
Yeah, good. Yeah, we've definitely seen that. And there's some places where it's not possible to dry it out. And basically you've got sedges in that environment, which thrive in that environment. They do their function well. It's still photosynthesizing, sequestering carbon.
Yep. They just don't feed a lot of critters.
Yeah, it doesn't. No, but it holds the soil in place and creates a great mat. Do you have any specific case studies, or even from your own experience there in the West, of individuals that you've seen that you hear about this doubling your carrying capacity and people making these claims, which I think that there's truth behind it.
Yeah.
But can you speak to that from your experience?
Yeah, we definitely have seen those levels of response. Now, it depends on what you're starting from. And I'll go to the rangeland situation first, and I'll come back to an irrigated situation. What really drives grazing use, the overall grazing efficiency on rangeland, is proximity to water. And if you have a lot of area of the rangeland that's more than a half a mile away from water, and about might be a mile and a half, 2+ miles, you don't get a lot of use out of those more distant acres. And as a matter of fact, the webinar that I'm doing after this one for Chadron State College there in Nebraska, it's on grazing cell design, and I'm going to specifically be talking about grazing distribution relative to water placement. But at a mile distant from water, you're usually running 20 to 30% lower utilization rate than within a mile distance of water. And depending on the terrain, that breaking might be closer to a half a mile than a mile. And so if you're in a really poorly watered range situation, you can pick up a lot of additional carrying capacity, not by growing any more forage, not by improving the plant community or soil health, but simply by getting the animals to the areas that they're currently not grazing. Now, if you are managing them in a rotation and managing time to where you're controlling the period of use and the amount of recovery, then in time you also see that increase in carrying capacity that comes with added production. And so we have seen many cases of doubling the carrying capacity on rangeland due to largely better grazing distribution in the short term, and in the long term, improvement in range condition. Now, on irrigated land, especially if it's flood ground that has been set stocked, which is absolutely the worst thing you can do with flood ground, because some part of it is wet in any day of the irrigation season. You have some areas that are wet and the cattle are going there, and it creates terrible compaction. And I am a big fan of sprinklers compared to flood. Yes, they cost a lot more money, but you get more water production out of an inch of water if it's coming through a sprinkler than it's flood. But also the fact that you can manage the soil moisture when you graze, you have greater opportunities for manipulating the plant community. It's actually pretty easy for me to show that investing in a sprinkler system has a good payback. So on irrigated land, if we are coming from set stock flood and we put on a sprinkler system, convert it to a K line or a pivot. If you're doing pivots, it better be a used pivot, but you can make that transition. And we have seen 3- and 4-fold increases in animal unit days per acre. That's how we measure yield on pasture. We have seen those 3- and 4-fold increases on irrigated land when they change from set stocking on flood ground to time-controlled grazing on sprinklers. Same piece of land, 3 to 5 years to get the land healed back up to where it's functioning in the sprinkler system. But going from 50 AUDs per acre to 200 AUDs per acre is not uncommon at all.
Interesting. That's neat. I appreciate you touching on that, because I'm largely adverse to technology, things that cost money and break down and depreciate.
Yep, I understand that.
But strategically, it makes sense. And maybe this is a good segue into coming into the economics a little bit here. I know with right now, you can't find feeder hay for under $300 a ton, $250 a ton here in the West. I would love to graze, but it's hard for any animal that I graze, even the direct marketing animals, to come close to the margin that hay does. Can you maybe speak to that a little bit specifically about grazing? We don't really need to touch the hay part. If people have questions, they can reach out to me and how we do gross margin analysis. But I guess to narrow that down a little bit, my question is, how much more feed can you grow through proper grazing versus just a once, like in my background here, this would be a field below our house where if we grew it for hay, we would harvest it once, get a little aftermath, but we could graze it, like you say, 3 or 4 times. So just any insights you can have on the economics of grazing.
I'll start with the economics. So there's several client ranches around the West that I check in with them, what's it costing them to do things. And this winter, the cost differential between a day of grazing and a day of feeding hay has run from $1.70 to about $2.10 a day, higher cost with hay. All right, so last year, and I look at everything, again, on an animal unit day basis. I look at our revenue stream per animal unit day harvested, our cost of production per animal unit day. And last year on this ranch where we've been living and working, cow-calf last year generated about $2.15 revenue per AUD harvested by the cow-calf herd. If it's costing you $2.15, or excuse me, $2.10 a day more to feed hay than it does to graze that cow, that tells you pretty quickly you don't have a very good chance at all of making any money on that cow-calf operation if you're feeding really any amount of hay at all. I talked to Dallas Mount with Ranching for Profit about this about a month ago. And he said he sees very few cow-calf operations feeding more than 60 days worth of hay that are profitable. That's one of his benchmarks, is you need to be able to graze at least 10 months, 8 out of 10 years to have any chance at profitability in the cow-calf business. So that feed cost difference is huge. The hay business, for people who are selling hay at $300 a ton, if they take the cost of the fertility that they're shipping out, what operating costs for harvesting hay were last year, a lot of them think they're making a couple $100 a ton. I figure they're making maybe $70, $80 a ton when you do a full cost accounting on it. And I don't know what your finances look like on your custom grazing or on the animals that you're finishing, but that's what you have to look at. You have to look at the net margin that you are making on grazing that land versus turning it into hay and selling it.
Can you talk a little bit about the fertility side and how you came up with an approximate value of not exporting that fertility?
Yeah. Just get a feed analysis on your hay with a full mineral profile. And what I do is I value N, P, K, calcium, and sulfur based on commercial fertilizer prices. And then the microminerals I do if you were buying that as livestock mineral supplement. And right now, a ton of hay has $70 to $75 worth of nitrogen and mineral nutrition in it. So if you are selling that hay off of your farm or ranch, you are exporting that much fertility. If your land is healthy and wonderful and full of biological life, that might be something that you can withstand. If your land is already depleted and requiring fertilizer inputs to maintain your production level, you are literally shipping that many dollars off your place. Late last summer, when nitrogen went over $1 a pound, which was the first time in my life that nitrogen had been over $1 a pound, also for the first time in my life, a ton of hay had over $100 worth of NPK and other minerals in it. And so if you are buying hay from someone else, you are bringing in that much fertility nutrition to your place. And a lot of people are excited about hay, being in the hay business out because the prices are so high. We got some good moisture. What's it going to be next year? Yeah. Is it going to be back to $300 or is it going to be 200 or 160? If fertilizer prices stay where they are right now, $160 is probably break even on making hay and selling it when you factor in the fertility loss that's going out.
That's great. Thank you for addressing that. That's something that if you don't look at it holistically, if you're just looking at it from an economic standpoint, you're not measuring the full cost. Maybe we can transition into some questions here.
Okay.
One of them, and Amber, if you're on and want to unmute, you can add clarity on this in the last about 15 minutes that we have with Jim. So she says that a neighbor runs sheep How can you incorporate sheep into the grazing rotations to improve plant diversity and create another revenue stream? To sum up her question, so multi-species grazing.
Multi-species grazing typically is a real good thing to do. And the more diverse your pasture is in terms of grasses, forbs, legumes, the greater the value of multi-species grazing. If you also have brush in the factor, then the other species would more likely be goats than sheep. Historically, we've always said you can run one ewe for every cow on the place, and you won't even know they're there, other than you'll have fewer weeds and more money. That if you've basically been a cow operation and you're running 100 cows, you should be able to carry 100 ewes on that place and have no negative impact on the cow performance at all. If anything, over time, you actually get a more positive response.
I have a question. Would I do the sheep after the cows or do them together?
Okay.
Sorry, my pastures are bigger and they have 1,000 and they have lots and lots of sheep.
Yeah. When we were in Missouri and we had cattle and sheep both, there were times we ran sheep ahead of cattle, times we ran cattle ahead of sheep, times we ran them together. It depends on what stage of production each class of animal is in and what your objective for that particular pasture is. If you're doing them separate, basically what you're trying to do, whichever class of animal has the higher nutrient requirement at that time, they're the leaders. They go in and cream off the best feed because they have a higher need. And then you clean up with the animals with the lower need. If basically they've got the same nutritional needs, you can run them together. If your objective is cleaning up some broadleaf weeds, then it makes sense to run the cows through first, let them take out the good quality cow feed, and that's going to leave the sheep with more pressure to eat those weeds that you're trying to target. Like everything else, Amber, that answer is it depends on what the resource is and what your objectives on that grazing cycle might be. There's no hard and fast rule that one always goes ahead of the other.
Would we take the cows out when we decide that the grass is where we need to take the cows out now? And then we put the sheep in, and how do we know when the sheep need to go?
If the sheep start taking your grass residual lower than you want it to be, they need to be out. So I would advise that you take the cows out, leaving more residual than what you think is the minimum acceptable for the cattle, and watch what the sheep eat when they come in. If the sheep are not eating the weeds you want them to, and they're just shortening the residual grass, then I would say go ahead and have the cows take off down to that minimum acceptable post-grazing residual, and then come in with the sheep so that they're more inclined to eat the weeds.
I see. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Good question, Amber. Katie, are you on? You could come off also another multi-species grazing question. Just saying that I know that in grazing and management applies at all scales. Do you see that one?
Yeah, I see that question there. Yeah, sheep have little bitty mouths and they eat like this. Cows have great big tongues and big mouths and they eat like that. That's the difference there. And depending on the plant community, you may not be able to get sheep to make the impact that you're looking for. If the base grasses out there are coarser, then you know what sheep really like to eat. They are going to be focused on just nibbling here, nibbling there, and the most desirable stuff, they'll nibble right down to the ground level, and you will be left with that coarse stuff still out there. Yeah, and then that's a downside of having just sheep. I've worked with a lot of small sheep flock operations over the years, and very often what I encourage them to do is if you have a neighbor who has cows, and it's an easy thing for them to move cows on and off, is get your neighbor in there with a cow herd to make impact on some of the pastures that they need to be. And I don't know what scale of operation you actually have there, Even if it's just a 2-acre pasture, if you have a good relationship with your neighbor, he might be able to run 50, 60 cows in there for a day or two, make the impact you need to get it refreshed for your sheep and get them out. See, this is one of the reasons you want to actually be friends with your neighbors.
Yeah, I think if we have that mindset rather than competing, how can we complement?
Yep.
And it can be mutually beneficial, and both from an economic standpoint and an ecological standpoint. I feel like we've just barely scratched the surface. Jim, if you're open to it, let's have you back on sometime and we can go to level 2. But why don't here at the end just give some closing thoughts and how to get a hold of you, Jim? The best way to contact you for those who would like to work with you, consult.
Unfortunately, I am trying my best to get out of the consulting business.
Okay.
I'm winding that down, still doing educational programming, and I have existing clients that I will continue to service. But it's people like you, Jared, who've been doing this for a while now, have picked it up. I'm going to point more people your way than bring them my way.
Okay.
For the direct consultation. But we do have a lot of educational information available. We do sell, and by we, our family business, American Grazing Land Services, we sell electric fencing, stock water supplies, forage seed. And we're real easy to find on the web. It's American Grazing Land Services.com, or actually, I guess it's just AmericanGrazingLands.com. But if you do a search for either Jim Gerrish or American Grazing Lands, you'll find us. Like I said, we at the store, there's a lot of, besides product, there's links to educational information. I believe we're linked to Jared's podcast there, along with several others. There's 40 some YouTube videos of my different presentations that are up there. Just go to our website and explore.
Yeah, and I'm going to put that in the chat right now so people can check that out and stay plugged in with Jim. And great, wonderful opportunity to have you on, Jim.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to speak to people.
You've been very gracious to provide that, and he's the one that we reach out to, even though there's local suppliers for fencing. You call him and you get what you maybe even. You can walk through what you actually need, and so they ship it. I've never been disappointed with any order that I've gotten from him, both from the high tensile permanent to the poly wire and portable and solar chargers and plug-in energizers. So just a great resource to talk to somebody who knows better than I do when it comes to the technical side of it.
Yeah, and that's not me you're talking to. If you call on the fence products, our son Galen is involved with that. If you're looking for forage seed, that's my wife Dawn. And then Todd Hart is another partner in our business. Usually if you call, the first voice you're going to hear is Todd. So yeah, we appreciate the plug there, Jared.
Oh, you bet. And I'm just going to add one last before we cut the recording here, agsteward.fyi/assessment. So don't be like me in my younger days where you're winding up your polywire with a stick. Sometimes we don't know the mistakes we're making until somebody asks us a good question with this assessment. So it's agsteward.fyi/assessment. We can, through a couple questions like Jim asked me, when are you going to get religious about this? We can assess like where you're at with your business, how to be able to help you to find those efficiencies.
I want to go ahead and say that I started out winding it up on sticks too.
Okay, I don't feel so bad.
Because I didn't think that I could afford one of those actual electric fence reels. They cost $18 or something.
I know.
And I'm talking 40 years ago, of course. And when I started using that, my response was, I can't afford not to do this. And then when the geared reels came around and they were like $30, I thought, I can't afford that. And then you use one and you realize you can't afford not to use. If you're going to be moving stock daily with polywire and stuff, it's like any other craftsman. You can afford to have the best tool available because you're using it on a daily basis to make your business operate better. All right, I'm done. I
Perfect.
see I've got to go.
Yeah,
But I
back on
got-
your next webinar, Jim. We sure appreciate you coming. Thank you very much, and blessings to you and your family.
Thank you very much. And I'm open. We'll do it again sometime.
Okay, sounds
All right.
good.
Thank you.